because this is an introductory course in reading poetry, we've talked mostly about content this semester and not very much about form. Discussions of form are a little more involved and more suited to an intermediate course in reading poetry. But we should say something about form, so let's do that by talking about the sonnet, perhaps the most well-known of all poetic forms. But before we talk about a specific poetic form, let's ask a more basic question. Why does form matter at all? A sonnet, as we will discuss shortly, is 14 lines. Why not 15, or 13, or 6, or 22? Well, it doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that a sonnet has to be 14 lines. But when evaluating something, we need to know what the rules are before we can assess the quality of the performance. Think about this. A basketball hoop is 18 inches in diameter for both sides. But if we played a game where one team shot at an 18-inch hoop and the other team shot at a 24-inch hoop, the rules wouldn't be the same. The team shooting at the 24-inch hoop would probably win, but we couldn't be sure that their performance was better. So we arbitrarily say that a hoop is going to be 18 inches in diameter for everybody. It's going to be 10 feet off the ground for everybody. A free throw is going to count 1 point for everybody. That way, we can evaluate the performance of both teams. It's the same way with poetry and other genres of literature. Certain established forms exist, and we evaluate the artist based upon how well they execute the forms in which they choose to work. And this is true of other forms of art too, painting and sculpture and architecture and music and so forth. Now, as time passes, the forms sometimes change. New forms are established, and that's okay. That's part of art. The point is that any artists work within some kind of rules. So you might say, well, what about free verse poetry? That is a frequently used phrase, but it is a misnomer. There is no such thing as genuine free verse poetry. Free verse poetry really means that the poet isn't working within established forms. The poet creates his or her own form. It may be different and idiosyncratic, but within that individualized form, there are certain do's and don'ts. If we don't have rules of some kind, we don't have any way to evaluate the poem. We don't know whether it succeeds or not because we don't know what the writer is trying to accomplish. Now, if we were to go very far down this road, we would be getting into higher level discussions about poetry than is appropriate for an introductory level class. So let's leave abstract discussions of form at that and talk about a well-established poetic form, the sonnet. And before we look at individual sonnets, let me explain the form. First, a sonnet is always 14 lines. But within that, there are two kinds of sonnets. The first type of sonnet that I want to explain is the English sonnet, sometimes called the Shakespearean sonnet. Shakespeare did not invent this form, but he was the most artful practitioner of it. Second is the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. I want to talk about the English sonnet first, and then we'll talk about how the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet differs from it. First, the English sonnet. The English sonnet consists of 4 parts. 3 things that we call quatrains and a couplet. A quatrain is a 4-line section that goes together. The first and third lines rhyme, and the second and fourth lines rhyme. A quatrain is usually pretty self-contained grammatically and thematically. So, there are 3 quatrains, that equals 12 lines. And then a couplet, 2 lines at the end that rhyme. In the English sonnet, the couplet usually states the theme. Couplets always rhyme. In the quatrains, every other line rhymes. That is the structure of the English sonnet, but that's not all. The English sonnet also has a certain rhythm pattern called iambic pentameter. Yikes! What is that? Well, an iamb is a 2-syllable phrase, which is called a foot or a meter, in which the first syllable is unaccented and the second syllable is accented. Gosh darn! That would be an iamb, a 2-syllable phrase with an unaccented syllable followed by an accented one. Now, penta is a prefix meaning 5. So pentameter means that there are 5 feet or meters or iambs in a line. So it might read something like this. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That is a line of iambic pentameter. 5 2-syllable phrases. In each one, the unaccented syllable precedes the accented one. So, the form is very strict. It's the poet's job to say what needs to be said, adhering to the correct form. Just like if a baseball pitcher wants to be admired for throwing a shutout, he has to stand on the rubber, which is 60 feet 6 inches from home plate. When he gets tired, he can't move closer. He can't ask for a strike zone to be bigger. He has to perform within the established rules. It's the same for poets working in an established form. Now, there is a second kind of sonnet form called the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. Petrarch was a medieval Italian poet. He wrote a lot of love sonnets to his loved one, Beatrice. And he used a different form, a 2-part form. The beginning section consists of 8 lines, and it's called an octave. And the second section, which is composed of 6 lines, is called a sestet. Now, the purpose of an octave is to do one of several things. Sometimes it raises a question. Sometimes it makes a statement. Sometimes it begins an image. Sometimes it establishes a setting. And it might do other things. The purpose of the sestet is to complete the octave. So, if the octave raises a question, the sestet answers it. If the octave makes a statement, the sestet responds to it. If the octave begins an image, the sestet completes it. If the octave establishes a setting, the sestet tells us about something that happens in that setting. Now, Italian sonnets vary in rhythm and rhyme more than English sonnets. And I think that's true because the Italian sonnet form was transplanted into English from another language. The rhythms of Italian are not quite the rhythms of English. So the rhythms that Petrarch used don't translate snugly into English. The rhymes and the rhyme patterns that work for Petrarch in Italian don't work as well in English. So the English sonneteers who use the Italian form, the two-part form, they experiment more with rhythm and rhyme. And we'll look at some of those examples in the sonnets that we examine.